welcome to the first episode of Liminal Phrames. We are incredibly grateful to have you, the listener, join us on this journey. I am your co-host, Nathan, and with me today is my friend and co-host, ExoAcademian. Exo, how's it going?
It's going great. Happy to be here. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, we have been talking about this for quite some time, and I'm super excited to get into this with you and kind of bring folks along on a journey that we are both on ourselves. And so, with that being said, why don't we get rolling here? Let's start with this. So, you've got an existing show already. You've been doing a show for just over a year now. I mean, how did you get into that in the first place, and kind of how did you get where you are right now?
Right. Well, I think what was happening was, kind of around, even though I have a long history with the phenomenon and was really fascinated back in the late 90s, was really interested in the Whitley Strieber books, followed that really closely. But then kind of, life happens and, get married and have kids and stuff, and kind of got put on the back burner for a while. Even though there were some experiences along the way that were pretty profound that I had personally. But then around 2017, when the stories started breaking in the mainstream and the New York Times came out with the articles, then I kind of took on a renewed interest, and it kind of stirred that fire again. And I got onto platforms like Twitter, UFO Twitter, and started dialoguing with people, and that felt really great, and really found a community there that felt like home. But that said, as you don't have to research this for very long. You don't have to familiarize yourself with this topic for very long, the UFO phenomenon and sort of anomalous phenomena in general, before you very quickly realize it takes a lot of nuance. It takes a lot of sophistication to do it justice. And so so 220 characters or whatever you get with Twitter these days to make a tweet, I realized it was difficult to say what I wanted to say and be understood. And so I thought, I kind of want to do something more long form where I can kind of, shape some arguments and both present some ideas, but also come up with a show that would allow me to process, and to do research and sort of share with the audience as I'm learning and growing and understanding it all. And so and there were a lot of shows already doing interviews, and I really wanted to, and at first I thought I might do interviews as well, but it kind of quickly evolved into me taking, the many spokes of the wheel within, the contact modalities in general, and breaking out shows looking at the phenomenon from different angles, talking about specific cases, in kind of the micro view, but also taking more of the macro view and discussing the different hypotheses that are put forward to explain what's going on. And, take the time to do sort of like a 30-minute, 40-minute show once a week, tackling each of those different ideas, and then build sort of a repertoire of understanding over time with an audience that gets to know me, and we have some shared background, that sort of relational background of, what I mean when I say this kind of thing, which I'm looking forward to doing with you here as well. So that's what Point of Convergence, that was the idea that spawned the show. And it's been that and more. It's been great. And it's been great to see that people have engaged with it and are interested in the topics that I'm interested in. And, people thank me, but at the end of the day, I'm going where my curiosity takes me. And I'm happy that other people are coming along for the ride. And just over a year in now. Yeah.
And the show's taken some different turns, I'm sure, as you have grown that audience and you have kind of looked at the topics that have piqued your curiosity. And one additional sort of turn in the road in that journey is kind of where we are right now. So, you've done a successful show. You've got a successful show. Why did you want to do this show with me? Like, what got you here?
Right. Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. And I think you and I sort of a few months ago started talking about, because I had been on your show, which I want to ask you about in a second, but I had been on Calling All Beings, and you guys had interviewed me. And I really appreciated, that was the first time I had sort of interacted with you, at least, virtually. And really appreciated the the way that you ask thoughtful questions. It was very clear that you're a deep thinker, that you're thinking about some of the same things I am in the same ways that I am. You really try and examine the frames that we use to make sense of these things, as well as the things themselves. We both have a similar background, in theology and biblical studies, which is its own framing of reality, which is really interesting. And so I was really impressed with the questions you asked and just the quality of your thinking about these issues. And as we began discussing more and more, then you reminded me that we live in the same area, which was crazy, of all the possibilities of where we could live in the
Wild.
world. We live really close together in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And that was really cool. And then, once I got to meet you in person, you were exactly as I expected you to be. And we just kind of hit it off. And we just realized that whether we're sitting over a coffee or a beer, conversation just flows and it sort of builds off each other. And I thought it wasn't because you just happened to be nearby that I said, well, I'll do this with Nathan. No, it's that, I really feel like this is a good fit. We kind of build ideas together, fire off each other. And so I thought, this gives me an opportunity to have more of a conversational kind of dialogue in real time. Because point of convergence, for those who haven't tuned in, it's kind of I take one idea and kind of do this, audio essay kind of thing. And whereas here I wanted to be sort of more stream of consciousness, in the flow, live, be able to talk about things that are happening in the news as we go and be able to do it in a kind of conversation format. And that's why I was really happy to do it with you. But let me ask you, same question. So, how did you get involved with Calling All Beings to begin with? And then from there, what brings you to this show?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, falling into Calling All Beings was not necessarily something I set out to do in 2021. I had been a longtime sort of fan of UFO Twitter for many years. In fact, before last year. And enjoyed following the conversation, enjoyed following the discussion. And in particular, I was following a specific podcast, that UFO podcast that Andy does, Andy McGrillen in the UK, and really enjoyed his interview style. And I had an opportunity once to jump into a chat with Andy and DJ, who's my current co-host at Calling All Beings, and had a good discussion with them, for DJ's podcast at the time. And after the fact, DJ reached out to me and he said, hey, this was a really great chat. I enjoyed it a lot. Maybe we should think about doing something together. And I said, I don't know, maybe that's a good idea. Let's take a closer look at that. We bounced around some ideas for the name of the show, landed on Calling All Beings, and here we are. So we've been, kind of putting together our own content for a few months now. And, it's interesting as I look back on, kind of that entire journey from being a participant in the conversation, not a content creator, and now being a content creator. There are different ways that sort of the individual can focus on this material, right? So and I think you'll relate to this a lot from your integral theory approach, but there's, very much kind of like an inner self approach to the material, and there's an outer self approach to the material. There's a community centered way of thinking about it, and there's an internal kind of dialogue way of thinking about it. And with Calling All Beings, which is kind of interesting, the dichotomy between that show and Point of Convergence. With Calling All Beings, it's very much more focused on the community discussion, kind of what's happening in the popular space of UFO Twitter, the kind of topics of the day. And it's also focused on the individuals themselves, kind of how do we foster a healthy dialogue with people. How do we create a nurturing environment that is positive and supportive so that we can together, kind of find our way toward some frameworks that help us make sense of what's going on. And so, the role that I play on that show is very much, kind of a thinker, but also just really a fan of the community itself, and trying to uplift the voices of the community and strengthen the ties that are there. So, yeah, it's been definitely an interesting journey. And, I guess, taking a step back from all that as well, when we've talked about this quite a bit, my entire life has kind of been thinking about the ways in which stories impact ourselves, so looking at individuals' experiences, looking at the narratives that we kind of find ourselves in when we're born and the ones that we craft as we go through life, and just holding those out and looking at them, turning them over, trying to make sense of them. And that kind of approach that I either, kind of came to on my own or was kind of taught to me at a young age, growing up in a pretty religious household, has really served me well in approaching this particular topic. It's really helped me to kind of look at the different experiences that people are sharing, and also the phenomenon that is related to the public from what the government has studied, and kind of think about, okay, what is happening, but also what is it doing? What is it doing to me as a person? What is it doing to us as a people? How are we kind of interacting, relating to whatever this happens to be? And I would say that it's not new. It's not new in the sense that, people talk about it being kind of an ancient phenomenon, but I don't even mean that. I just mean the human experience is not new. The experience of existence itself, right? So how we go through our life and the seasons of our lives, and how we've done that through history. It's always been this sort of act of it's been an active process, where people are really engaged in narrative forming and then taking that story and helping them kind of chart a path in their own life and make sense of what is happening, both in your past and your future.
Right. And so, so that got you to where you were with Calling All Beings. What specifically about doing this show with me was interesting to you?
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, I can remember the moment where I had this kind of aha situation. I was sitting out on my deck and I was listening to Point of Convergence, and I don't know if I just never picked up on it before, but when you closed the show, you said deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and I was like, well, I'm deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Where is this guy?
Right.
And I got to find this guy. So I reached out to you, sent you an email, and you responded, which was, for me, a real positive thing. I wasn't expecting a response, but your show and who you are as a person, it's apparent to me after the several conversations that we've had up to this point that we share a pretty similar, kind of fabric of the way in which we think about this issue, the issue of the phenomenon, but the way we think about kind of the world in general. So there's not a lot that when you and I are talking together that I have to kind of really unpack for you. And so I found that to be, and I think it's a funny word to use, but relaxing. It's just nice to be able to kind of do that. And you don't have to get into a lot of the explainers. You just kind of know where I'm coming from. And then I think too, there's a value that I think that our perspectives bring to this, right? And that, having both kind of grown up with a religious studies sort of viewpoint, I think it allows us to look at this in a way that is unique, but also a way that is, I would hope, kind of affirming. It's not something that, and I know you've had your own, specific experience, but it's not something that, at the end of the day, kind of puts us both in a state of, ontological confusion. We're sort of ready to deal with these things and try to make sense of them, and we're comfortable with exploring a lot of the different avenues. So this particular show is a great way for us to do that in a kind of thinking out loud sense, for both of our audiences, but also for ourselves. This is something that I think really feeds our own sort of curiosities and needs when it comes to this topic. How many people can say they have a close friend in town or whatever that they can have a chat like this on and just, pick up right where you left off and it'd be very, engaging and entertaining and illuminating. you know?
Yeah, it's sort of, I think about the funny meme where people say, someone in a coffee shop says, randomly, so what do you do for interest? What's your hobby? And the person begins the slow introduction to, well, I'm really fascinated by UFOs and aliens. And they're like, well, nice meeting you. Okay, we'll see you later.
Great talking with you.
And they take off. Whereas you and I, we get together, over a beer, over coffee, and that's what we talk about for a couple hours straight.
Yep.
So, yeah, but I mean, I think that another thing that I think both you and I bring to this that we share in common is having already, moved through a couple different sort of life frames ourselves.
Yeah.
Like we both grew up in, or I didn't grow up so much, but later on sort of took on more of a religious kind of perspective, and you grew up in one. But we kind of also transcended that. So we've lived within different frames of meaning, right? So, and having progressed through those and moving on to different ones, what I've found is that it allows you to be more flexible and reflective and multi-perspectival when it comes to looking at reality in general. And for something as complex and bewildering, as the UFO phenomenon, I find that's really helpful and useful to be able to put on different pairs of glasses, look at it from different perspectives, different angles, different meaning models, and try to make sense of it, because it's so, it really is so discombobulating is the word I like to use. It really helps to look at it from different angles. And in fact, I think only by doing that do we begin to piece together some kind of model that makes sense. But it also allows us to relate to lots of different kinds of people. Some people do sort of take a very spiritual perspective to this entire phenomenon, some from a positive viewpoint and some from a negative one. But we can relate to that because we've been in those circles. I've also, as I'm sure you have too, have spent some time where I pretty much was a flatland modernist, where I had an empirical view of the world, and if I can't measure it and study it, it doesn't exist, kind of thing. So I understand the scientific and academic community who take that kind of view. But I also, partly because of who I married, transcended that view and began to realize, there's all sorts of aspects of reality that exist no matter how much we try to, shove them into a box and put them in the closet. They're actually going on. And so you, having progressed through each of those different, viewpoints, ways of seeing the world, it allows you to relate to each of those people, but also to bring all of those different perspectives together when we're trying to make sense of this all.
Yeah. So, as you were talking about that and, the frameworks, we keep kind of coming back to that. And it's funny that we landed on using that as part of the name of this show. But the name itself, I think, has a lot of different layers to it. So maybe we can unpack that a little bit and kind of talk through how we came up with this. So the show is called Liminal Phrames, and Frames is spelled with a PH. And I think folks who follow this will probably understand why we chose that. But what's your reaction to kind of the name of the show, and what is it that you were sort of hoping it would elicit in terms of what people take away from it?
Right. I mean, I think a couple things. We were tossing around different terms that make sense. As soon as we landed on liminal, I thought right away, that's a great sort of catch-all word that sort of takes in the totality of what I think we might be discussing and what different aspects that are related. Just to give people a bit of a background here, I grabbed a couple of definitions here. Liminal can refer to relating to a transitional or initial stage of a process. Another definition is occupying a position at or on both sides of a boundary or threshold. And in anthropology, liminality is the quality of ambiguity or disorientation that occurs in the middle stage of a rite of passage when participants no longer hold their pre-ritual status, but have not yet begun the transition to the status they will hold when the rite is complete. So, even as I was reviewing those definitions, I thought that's so bang on for what the phenomenon is, and for those of us trying to make sense of it, and for those of us feeling like we have one foot in the, quote unquote normal world and 1 foot in high strangeness constantly, either by direct experience or just from knowing so many people that are going through that. and that strange feeling of, we're the 1% or whatever. They're walking around thinking about this all the time. We're surrounded, kind of like the Matrix, surrounded by people who are largely oblivious to it.
Yeah.
And so liminal seems like a great word in that sense, in terms of where we are in time and within our culture. But also because I think that, it may be that the phenomenon is ramping up. There's some evidence of that, and that we are in the process of even the meaning making models that we apply to the world, what life is, what reality is, the fabric of reality. All of that is coming into question for those of us who really pay attention to the data. And there's a sense that sooner or later, our entire civilization is going to have to grapple with that kind of information and make that transition into something new that we can't really fully understand what it's going to be yet. But it's very clear that the way we used to make sense of the world doesn't fit with what's coming out in the phenomenon. So there's that, and then the frames piece was realizing that, again, whether it's a different hypothesis you apply to it, and I've sort of been working with this idea that we sort of conveniently use this term, the UFO phenomenon, as kind of a catch-all meta category, but that likely involves, from my perspective, many different kinds of entities, different intelligences, probably with different origin stories, whether it's extraterrestrial, interdimensional, extra-dimensional. I think all that's in the fold, and part of the mistake we kind of make, or the assumption we make, is because we've so long lived in this idea that in the modern world that, unless I can see it and measure it and shake hands with it, it doesn't exist. Right. And so even if we begin to open the door a little bit to say, okay, so maybe ETs exist, and okay, maybe they're here, although that's a stretch for most people, but to actually flip open Pandora's box and say, we're maybe part of a multiverse that's teeming with interdimensional life, maybe just tiny, the thinnest membrane separating us from entities galore kind of thing. So there's that as well. How do we apply different frames to understanding all of that? How do we make sense of the fairy lore having so much crossover with gray aliens? Are those different entities? Are they the same ones? Are we just conflating those because we're just not familiar and not comfortable maybe with just how diverse and richly populated the multiverse is? So that's some of the ideas I think of when I think of liminal frames. What about for you?
Yeah, so I love those definitions, and it's funny that I looked at them a little bit when we were kind of bouncing around names, but I didn't look at them in detail. But hearing them, a couple words, jumped out at me. Ambiguity and disorientation, are words that were there, and I think very much that they apply to the phenomenon, the experience of the phenomenon, right there. That when you start kind of entering the playground of these ideas, you're kind of letting in to your own way of thinking these new possibilities that weren't there before. And what does that do to the way that you think about the world, the way that you think about relationships, the way that you interpret your past and think about your future? All of these things kind of play in with your individual human experience. And so, for me, that liminal state, that, not quite asleep, maybe not fully awake, that transitory kind of period, it's just really spot on for what it feels like, kind of navigating the literature of the phenomenon, the individual experiencer accounts. If you're taking all of this stuff at face value, and even if you're not, if you're taking a critical look at it, and hopefully folks are, you're still having to come to a place where it hopefully challenges your conceptions of reality. And I think that that's a healthy thing to do for anyone, no matter where you really land at the end of the day. On this particular topic of UFOs and the UFO phenomenon itself, if at the end of the day you kind of discount the whole thing, I think it's still a healthy exercise that we go through this. And I think as well, something that you touched on that got me thinking about our kind of future, the future of humanity, provided we don't sort of prematurely end that. But these are kinds of things that are important to do. The thought exercises that we do now, that our philosophers do, and our ethicists and our theologians and our scientists, all of these theories that we entertain, notions that we examine, they better prepare us for a future that will inevitably be strange to us as in our current way of understanding the world. And so for us to kind of wade into those waters and be more comfortable with that territory and play with those ideas, I think it, in a way kind of inoculates us against the strangeness that will eventually come. And, so these ideas hopefully make their way into our literature. They make our way, into our science, and they propel us forward so that our collective and our individual mind spaces are better prepared for the strange future that lies ahead. And, the frameworks aspect of it, is incredibly fitting as well, because, as you hinted at, I think it's hard for me, at least, to hold a singular position, a singular framework on what it is. And I think, it's healthier for me, at least, to kind of have a diverse diet of theories, because that allows me to take different experiences and examine them through these different lenses and see in that process of examination what new things emerge, what new sort of truths emerge, or what new ideas are sparked because of that lens and that examination itself. In a way, we're kind of, it's like we're playing with puzzle pieces where we don't, one, know if we have all the pieces, and two, we don't even know what the picture of the puzzle looks like. But we know that we're playing with something that feels and has a real significance to it. And so I think being able to lay those various frameworks out in one's mind or on the table and kind of be able to articulate them and share them with other people, really enriches the experience across the board, and hopefully provides a richer sort of set of conclusions, or at least a richer set of theories as to what exactly the phenomenon might be at the end of the day.
Right. Yeah. And I think, you mentioned earlier that I have a background in integral theory. And, one of the things that integral theory tries to do is look at reality from 4 different quadrants. You have an I space, a we space, the it space, the sort of more objective analysis, and then it's in terms of the plurality of that. But sort of those are the big 3 you can think of: I, we, and it. And like I was saying earlier, the empirical model is sort of, let's only pay attention to the it because that's objective, it's measurable, therefore it's real. Everything else is kind of mushy subjectivity, right? And yet, what I love about integral theory is it says, no, the only way you can make sense of the totality of human experience and of reality and the fabric of reality is to look at it from all 4 quadrants, or all 3 of those sort of main domains. And that's totally true for the UFO phenomenon as well. And so when I look at the frames that usually get applied, people are often unconscious about the frames they're bringing, the framework, the grid they're applying to it. And so they think that, look, I'm just applying our shared reality model to what's going on. And I'm like, well, no, you're actually sharing an empirical model and saying that only what I can catch in this net counts, right? And so, for instance, experiencer accounts are often downplayed by people trying to look at more of an empirical approach.
Right.
And yet I think Jacques Vallée, thankfully pioneered this back in the 70s, saying, no, actually interviewing these really credible people who otherwise are professional people with families who have no background with mental illness, really seem to be, not only have been encountered something really anomalous, but they've been permanently changed by the experience, right? That's one of the most impacting aspects of this, is that people don't just have something happen that really is difficult to deal with and then they go back to the life they had before, but rather they are often changed forever by these experiences. And then when you add to that there's so much commonality all around the world, even cross-culturally and over time, with people having these experiences, and there's so much overlap in the data in the terms of kind of things they run into, even though they're totally
Right.
bizarre, elements, and yet they happen time and time again. For people who are, again, credible individuals, no history of making stuff up, and even more so when even if you say there's a small percentage of people who are doing
Hmm.
that, when you look at the totality of the data, it's very clear that something is going on. It's impacting people, and how it changes people is just an important measure, just as an important measure as soil samples and radar returns and that kind of
Yeah.
thing. In fact, Vallet's frame that he applies is this idea that perhaps a collective unconscious evolution is what's in play
Mm.
here. That And what's fascinating about that idea is that a high intelligence, whether that be aliens or some sort of extra dimensional godlike figure or
Hmm.
whatever, um, you know, is able to shape potentially the evolution of consciousness on the earth without us ever being aware that it's happening,
Right.
because it's happening at an unconscious
Mm.
level. And so even that frame is fascinating to me,
Hmm.
that for every space we try and look at, whether we look at outer space with the extraterrestrial hypothesis, or we look at inner space when we look at the collective unconscious and tulpas and egregores and things like
Hmm.
that, or you look at the spiritual dynamic and sort of celestial or extra dimensional beings. I think all of that is in the picture,
Yes.
and that's why this is, on the one hand, kind of gloriously overwhelming. It's almost unfathomable, but in a way that makes you almost feel like a kid,
Right.
just saying, "Wow, reality is so." Beautifully multifaceted, even though it sometimes can be terrifying as well.
Yeah.
And so for me, the only way to try and make sense of that is to try on different pairs of glasses, look with different frames, analyze the data from those different domains, the I space, the we space, the it
Hmm.
space, and try to begin to weave together a fabric that can include all of that.
Yeah. Love it. Yeah. I mean, you have to. And then, that gets me to, I guess, like bringing it down to a particular perspective. So, we just wrapped up 2021 and start of a new year here. Looking back on the past year, what were kind of some of the standout moments for you, both with respect to the topic of the phenomenon, but also I think in your own kind of sort of personal journey or the show, or what kind of reflections do you have on the last year?
Yeah, it's been fascinating, and I think part of the challenge that any of us who are into this day to day kind of perspective with this phenomenon, it's hard for us, I think, to have. Speaking of
Mm.
perspective, to have an accurate perspective on where we are in terms of the greater society.
Hmm.
How close are we to some breakthrough moment where suddenly every headline in the world is about UFOs and aliens,
Right.
whether they be extraterrestrial or interdimensional or whatever. I think that because we're into this every single day, um, it feels like it's always
Mm.
imminent, right? It feels like any day now this is gonna, and we turn on the news and think, wow, wait a second, why is that not? Well, I don't see anything,
Right.
or if it is mentioned, it's really in passing. There almost seems to be like, and this is its own conversation, kind of this collective apathy, and you
Mm.
ask where that's coming from. I think there's multiple reasons why that exists, but on the other hand, you can't help but look and say, wow, this has been a historic,
Yeah.
time, with the passage of the bills that, is for the first time in history saying, this is going to be studied. This phenomenon is going to be studied. It won't be, shoved under the rug. It won't be just under the purview of some black ops program,
Hmm.
but, Congress is going to be informed about this. There will be both, classified and unclassified briefings. I mean, that's historic. There's no way you can look at it any other way, and that's really fascinating and exciting. Again, it's still bizarre to me that it's not getting more
Hmm.
play in the mainstream, but that tells me we're in a very different place than we were, and I think that momentum has been growing ever since 2017 and sort of the breakthrough articles, but even going back before then to, what some of the investigations done at Skinwalker Ranch and,
Hmm.
NIDS, OSAP, ATIP, all that stuff has kind of been leading up to this.
Right.
Um, so that's what's been happening sort of in the general. For me personally, the last year has really been kind of like what you hinted at. I really don't land with one perspective when it comes to this phenomenon, and the moment that I think I'm seeing something that looks pretty consistent,
Mm-hmm.
I'll see something that tells me, the opposite end of the data kind of thing, that contradicts the previous data.
Right.
And, people like John Alexander have talked about, the trickster element and this precognitive sentient phenomena, he called
Mm-hmm.
it, where, and just even historically, there's been this notion of the trickster phenomena that, confounds our attempt to understand what's going
Yeah.
on. So there's even this active sense that, in my own life, sometimes I feel like things are happening that are meant to throw a curve or throw a wrench into things just when I think I'm grasping for understanding. But I think, unlike some people, I've learned to sort of just enjoy that and go for the
Mm.
ride. And again, knowing that this is probably a plurality of different intelligences and entities and
Mm.
phenomena. Um, so I've over time relaxed into that and just, let myself take in the glorious,
Mm.
complexity that is the phenomenon and paranormal activity in general. The One thing I've been impressed by over and over again is just how these bizarre connections, how a place like Skinwalker Ranch, you have UFOs and Sasquatch and shadow people, what look like, animals coming out of the Jurassic era,
Mm.
walking out of portals,
Right.
this kind of thing, how somehow this is all together, that these co-arising phenomena that we've often studied as separate,
Mm-hmm.
tells me that somehow this is saying something cohesive about reality. We need to make sense of it from that point of
Mm.
view. Um, so it's been a fascinating year, both publicly and privately for me because of that.
Yeah.
How about for you? What's 2021 moving into 2022 look like for you?
Yeah, well, and before I transition to me, I actually have a question for you because it got me thinking. I mean, about, and this is something I experience as well. I mean, do you have you had moments of genuine frustration with this? So where you mentioned that you're at a place now where it's a little bit more kind of going with the flow of the river, right? Of the change of the different experiences that are out there. But were there moments where you kind of like you were banging your head against the wall and it's like, why can't this be clearer? Why can't this be easier to understand? And how did you, one, what was it like being in that moment? And two, was there something that really kind of catapulted you out of that? Or it just kind of took time to arrive at the place that you're at now?
I think that again, having a background in integral theory and having sort of progressed through different worldviews myself, where I literally look at the world differently, look at reality
Mm-hmm.
differently. Um, I think that I already was kind of familiar with that kind of approach. With the phenomenon, I think that part of the it's sort of a frustration, but it's more like it's just the nature of the beast, which is that. Because we can't study it in a laboratory, because we can't, reproduce it on demand, even when we bring sensor equipment out to Skinwalker Ranch, it'll deliberately, some sort of intelligence seems to confound our ability to photograph
Mm.
it, to take videos of it, to get accurate sensor data that we can make sense of. And like, again, John Alexander kind of alluded to, when it's always one step ahead of you, that even the linearity of time you can't trust, then you realize there are so few baselines.
Mm.
That's what I keep coming back to, is whenever I hear people having strong beliefs about it's this or it's
Yeah.
that, my perspective is always according to what baselines. Like, if you don't have a certain set of baselines you can begin with and have people agree generally that yes, we can say this is the case, therefore how about this? So in other words, it's hard to even formulate
Mm.
hypotheses when you don't have really strong footing. It's like trying to build a
Mm.
skyscraper on water soaked land.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult. I think that the other challenge is, as much as experiencer accounts are central to understanding what's going on, because of that, we're always getting to some degree an interpretive lens on something that happened,
Yeah.
right? Because we can't reproduce it, and because it seems to elude being videoed or taking really high quality pictures, which again is kind of a joke in the mainstream, right? But because it seems to be able to avoid that happening, we are left with interpretive takes on things that happen to people. And so it even gets difficult to know, okay, was this a case where, and there's so many elements, like even the degree to which people have done their own shadow work and work through their own subconscious, and how much fear do they generally have? Because, one thing that's become clear in my investigations is that the attitude you bring, consciously or unconsciously, to these experiences seems to really change the nature of the experience itself. And I've been doing some research recently into reincarnation and near-death experiences, and some of the same elements come up there, where when you're in these subtle realms, the smallest difference in your approach and your mentality, again, even if, I'm not saying it's people's fault, it's not, because much of this is unconscious, but everything we bring seems to also be a major factor in what ends up happening. So that makes it even more difficult to feel like you can say, okay, there's this group of experiencers, and there's this group, and there's this group. It's difficult to do because we're all different. We all bring our own histories, our own fears or not, to the picture. So yeah, there was some points of frustration just with how few baselines we have. But, I think I've sort of adopted the perspective of looking at this more like an adventure, and just not wanting the journey to end to some degree. Like, I want clarity. I don't think I look at disclosure the same way that a lot of people do, because I think that, again, we're just seeing the very tip of the iceberg right now. And, it's not something you can resolve in a few months or a year or even a decade. I mean, we're talking about completely revolutionizing the way we see the fabric of reality. Full stop. That's what's on the table here.
Right.
So I'm aware that for the rest of my lifetime, we will be unwrapping this, and trying to make sense of it. That's what I would say about that.
Yeah, no, I love that perspective. And, I like to use the analogy too, that, if an alien or whatever, choose your favorite hypothesis, were to land in front of your house and give you an opportunity to ask a question, and it gave you an answer, surely at that point you would have more questions. And if you don't have more questions, then, to me, there's a bit of a problem. So that it's the nature of, at least I would think, either consciousness itself, or at least it's a quality of human consciousness to be forever curious. And so, looking back on 2021, for me, it's almost like, yes, I felt like we made very good progress in terms of making this topic easier to discuss in the public sphere. And I think it is still at a very, very, in its early infancy there. But we do see it talked about more frequently than we did in the past. There is some growing momentum. I think that the NDA language is really going to help shift the conversation, because it's one more step in the pathway of legitimizing this topic. If you think about, kind of laying down stone to build a path, like, it's just one more stone that is now on the ground. And it takes, a series of successive stones before you get that pathway finished and people can use it. And then people feel like, well, this path has always been here, so we really are kind of in that journey and participating in that journey by the work that we do, I think, within the community, by helping to normalize this conversation. And I think too, there were some other notable moments for me, at least, like the Bix contest was really interesting. And I just finished reading Dr. Jeffrey Mishlov's paper that won the first place prize in that competition, and was just fascinated by the amount of research that he compiled on the survival of consciousness after death. So there are all of these threads that are kind of getting woven together, and they're helping us kind of form this greater picture that I would hope sort of gives us the maybe the encouragement, or it's like a quiver, an arrow in your quiver that you can use to kind of move this forward, in not only in kind of engaging people that have never thought about this before, but also moving your own thinking forward in it as well. And so, I found 2021 to be kind of a hopeful year for the topic. And I think that looking ahead at this year, there is a lot of optimism that, while we recognize, after it being, 4 years since the New York Times article, that it's not going to be an overnight thing. I think people have kind of come to that place where it's not like it's going to happen and tomorrow we're going to get all these answers. We're now kind of getting comfortable with that truth, that it's going to take some time to get where we're going, and that whatever answers may come won't end the discussion. They're really just going to broaden the discussion. And I think what I'm really looking forward to and very fascinated by is sort of what quality, what character does this conversation take on once people that don't think about it all the time begin to engage with it? What questions do they bring to the table? How does a greater public awareness influence the topic itself? And two, let's not forget, whatever these others are, how responsive are they going to be to our efforts to understand it, presuming that we are putting into place more formal efforts to do so. So what are these other things? What are these others going to do as we kind of reach out for it? Will it reach back a little bit and reciprocate in kind? I think that would be very interesting to see. So yeah, that's kind of how I'm thinking about this year. And I don't know how you think about that in terms of not only, I guess, the short-term view, but the long-term view. What are some things that you look for as, kind of notable achievements that you're looking to see occur?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one aspect of this, sort of from a sociological point of view, that I've really considered a lot is, when it comes to disclosure, there are, different levels of consciousness, different developmental levels, different worldviews, even within just American culture, let alone around the world. And so, I sometimes hear people say, how will our civilization respond? And really, we have numerous civilizations living on the planet right now, and I don't say that lightly. Like I really do mean we see reality very differently.
Yes.
So, when these revelations do hit, if they hit anytime soon, then I think the responses will be very, very different around the world, and even within our own culture.
Yeah.
We've seen even within American society how something like a pandemic is handled very differently by different groups, and trust in government, is very different for different people. And it's interesting to see how quickly even government begins to panic a little bit when it feels like it doesn't know how to handle something. When you have a once in a century pandemic come along, there's a lot of scrambling to figure out what is the best way to do this. What's the balance between the short-term harm and the long-term harm?
Mm-hmm.
How do you balance, economic concerns with trying to make sure as few people as possible die from the pandemic?
Right.
These are really difficult questions without easy answers, right? And then you think about something like the revelation that, we are being visited by, and perhaps have been cohabitating all along without realizing, with highly sophisticated non-human intelligence that basically plays us like they are higher on the food chain than we are.
Right.
Some people who have a perspective that, all there is in reality is human beings and animals, and then you've got angels and demons, basically. Some people have that perspective in different religions.
Sure.
So both within fundamentalist Christianity as well as fundamentalist Islam, for instance. So when they see these others walk onto the scene, they immediately go, okay, either they're angelic or demonic. They're going to have a very different response than someone who says, looks at the fruit of it and says, wait a second, they're here, assuming they are here to, for instance, provide technology and to help us sort of evolve, because that's one of the narratives, right? There's numerous narratives within the UFO phenomenon. One of them is that they're here to help us evolve our consciousness, and that part of them showing up at this period in our history is because we're at the precipice of self-destruction. So some people will look at that and say that's a good thing, whereas other people, no matter what evidence is on the table suggesting they're here to help, if they are, then there will still be some people who refuse to believe that. So then you've got a clash of civilizations just within the human population, right? So, but what's fascinating to me in all that is that's all the hypotheticals, right? But when I spoke to Ross Coulthart late last year, he made it clear that the sources he's talking to in the intelligence community say that the phenomenon, one aspect of it anyway, is ramping up. So we're talking about the vehicles or the phenomena that's being encountered out on the oceans, right? That seems to be increasing both in the number of vehicles that are seen and how often they're seen. So it doesn't seem like they're peering over the horizon then disappearing again. They are making their presence known. It's kind of a blatant, here we are, what do you think, what are you going to do about it? So it seems like there's either a direct intention to engage with us or to see how we'll respond, whether it's a test or whatever. Perhaps the phenomenon wants to see how the governments will respond. But what's fascinating to me is that if it's true that there's this ramping up going on, not by government coming forward and not by more people coming forward necessarily, but by the phenomenon itself engaging with us differently than it has in the past, then that is the X factor that it's very difficult to know what's going to happen. And as much as we talk about disclosure and the secret keepers, that may become irrelevant if this ramps up all the more. That's the biggest thing I'm looking for. Is it demonstrably true that the ramping up is happening? And is that just one aspect of the phenomenon, or is it more than that? Is there a cooperation amongst different intelligences? And what does that mean in terms of the near future?
Yeah, totally. And I kind of posted this on Twitter the other day. I think it was yesterday, that there's a thought experiment, so if you are this intelligence and you have this, kind of high technology, what are the things you'd be looking for in humanity to kind of give that technology or share that technology with us? What would you be, kind of signs or things would you be looking for to see? And I got a lot of interesting responses to that, but your comment about the kind of diversity of human culture, to me, it points out a significant issue in this entire relationship. And that is that, if we are going to enter into a relationship with whatever this is, and there, as you've pointed out, and are very good at pointing out, it could be a multitude of different things, there need to be in place, sort of some degree of kind of like predictable assurances that we can utilize the technology if it is shared with us in some form, in some way that would be responsible. And if it's not shared with us at all, well, let's say that they, reveal themselves more overtly, and there is no real relationship that is built. It's just they're here and they're kind of just ever present. That changes the dynamic quite dramatically. The power dynamic is really very much shifted in their favor, at least. And we could argue that it always has been, but very visibly in their favor in that situation. What I would hope to see, and this is just maybe my inner optimism, is that if the phenomenon does become more of an active player in human affairs, that it is more relational, that there is some level of cooperation, that there is some scientific discovery, there is something that kind of allows us to gain a greater, more mature perspective on what it means to be human beings, what it means to be sort of humans and or Earthlings, our place in the grander galaxy. Those are the things that I would really be looking to see and be very hopeful for. And because there have to be. It's fairly clear to me anyway, at least from the reported phenomenon, that there are so many layers that exist that we do not understand. That our current perception of reality is incredibly limited in scope. And if you take a historical view, even just looking back at our own past, look at our own science, you can go back really every few generations and kind of see the hubris in the science of the day that, this is how it works. This is what we think is going on. And we can't conceive of anything that would come along that would be any different than what's happening right now, or whatever we can conceive of as just a slightly better version of what we have right now. But if you advance that clock and you look ahead in history to now, and take now as a comparison to say a few hundred years ago, the kinds of things that we're doing and working with, and the way in which we're expanding out into our own galaxy, these are things that would have just seemed totally fantastical. So, you take that concept just over the span of a few hundred years and extrapolate that out to 1,000 years, many millennia, a million years, a billion years. I mean, the universe is incredibly old. And if there have been, sort of advanced intelligences around for that long, who knows what their sort of perception of reality is, their master of base reality. There's so much there that it will keep us busy. It will keep the philosophers and the scientists and and the artists, all of us busy for a very long time. And to me, that it feels kind of daunting in a way. It's like there's this sort of modern need to know. I want to know. I want to have the answer. At the same time, I think if you're thoughtful about it, you'll come to a place that reality becomes very exciting. That hopefully becomes the frame that you put on in order to perceive the entire process. That it very much is a process, and we are players in a long sort of string of players. We are playing a part in kind of that journey, and it's an important part, not to diminish the role that we have right now.
Yeah, I mean it really is fascinating, and I was just thinking as you were talking there about the possibility that Lou Elizondo has talked about this, for instance. What if there are some of the others who are here that for them we're more of an afterthought. We're the same way that we think about a monkey species in the jungle. Like, yeah, we know they're there, but they don't really affect the way we live our lives and we run our civilization in city centers, right? What if that's how some of them look at us? That will be, I think, incredibly destabilizing and will challenge the egoic mentality of much of humanity. That's the one thing I don't think hardly anyone in sort of mainstream culture is prepared for. That that they're here, they've been here all along, and they don't actually think that much about us. We're just kind of like another species on the landscape. Very, very few, if ever, have you seen a scientific or a science fiction movie come out where it's like, oh yeah, the humans, whatever.
Right.
That's not usually what happens. We're usually the center of the story.
That's right.
They land on the White House lawn. They either say, we're here to be your friends, or they're here to give us a warning, but we're always like central to the story, right? So I think one of the biggest shakeups will be if for some of these others, we're actually not central to the story. That will be a shock to the system because, ever since we, learned how to use fire and, invented the wheel, we've thought of ourselves as the top of the chain. So to not even be that big a deal for some of them will be incredibly shocking. So, there's just so many ways it can go. And when we talk about disclosure or making contact with these others, again, the question I come back to is, which group of the others do you mean?
Right.
I think that because, like you said, the universe is a very old place, and because now, even with cutting edge physics, we think it's likely there's a multiverse and there could be realities living right alongside us. So that opens up all sorts of possibilities. We could have parallel humans who evolve slightly differently because a small, the butterfly effect, one small change, 100,000 years ago completely changed the way they think. Maybe they're telepathic, or whereas we're not, even though we seem to have that dormant possibility in us. There's, it just, you step back and you go, I don't know how to put a box around this. There's so many possibilities. And my sense is that, it's more complex, more colorful than we can even conceive of. Um, and so that leaves us in a very interesting place. And what that means for the future, I don't know. To be honest with you, I'm surprised that, speaking again of that ramping up we're seeing by some element of the phenomenon, whatever that is really fascinating to me. That is probably the one thing that really, tickles my brain a lot, because I ask myself, to what end, and there's even been discussion of the military trying to sort of bait some elements of the phenomenon, right? By running certain military exercises, all with the intention, of actually causing a manifestation, a sighting, And while I'm, suspicious of this notion that the phenomenon responds like an if-else statement, that if we do something, it does something, I don't think it's that simple. But the fact that this is happening at all is fascinating to me, and that it is ramping up. We're so used to cautioning ourselves and saying, listen, every year, someone says, this is the end of the world, or this is going to happen this year, the Savior is going to show up this month, for you and I, coming from a religious background, Jesus is coming soon, meaning that he's going to reveal himself in the second coming, has happened every 6 months since we were born, right? And going back hundreds of years, thousands of years. So, and yet human beings don't stop doing that, right? Yes. So in the same way, we have to be cautious to not think that this is really going to happen soon, that something's going to change soon. But at the same time, when you look at it objectively and you see that ramping up, you can't help but ask yourself, and you tie to that the fact that, our government is finally taking it seriously, that doesn't have the same snicker factor that it did before. We don't always have X-Files music playing alongside these segments, says that something, I think, really is changing. And is that part of another cog in the wheel that's meant to be part of them introducing themselves to us? These are all fascinating questions, which, I could go 100 different directions on.
Right. I mean, is our science and the kind of frontier of our scientific discovery, are we really kind of getting close, brushing up against the cusp of the phenomenon itself in a way that we haven't before? Are there precursors, which is, I think, what you're essentially saying, that there are precursors that must come into place before all of the picture is revealed, or more of the picture is revealed. And I think that not to anthropomorphize it too much, but if we were to take our own sort of perspective on this, if we were able to observe an intelligent species on Earth that was developing its own science, using its own tools, and coming along, and they had a rudimentary awareness of our presence. So let's say that there was some aquatic species that was doing this. They just didn't quite understand, who we were or whatever, because their sphere is in the ocean, ours is up here. I think I would like to think that we would be a little bit thoughtful about kind of interactions there. At least some of us would be, maybe not all of us, but we would at least try to be very thoughtful about how we relate with them, and wait for that right moment before sort of revealing to them, hey, this, we're here, and we have this to offer you, and what will come to sort of to this wider experience that you were unaware of before. But even in that analogy, which may be a good one, maybe not, but in that analogy, the ocean-dwelling intelligence can still only dwell in the ocean, right? So, that there is this kind of translation problem that may always be present because of the way in which our evolutionary sort of brains perceive reality itself. And we may be incapable of really understanding the scope of reality as it is known to these other intelligences. And on that point, I think what makes me curious about our technology. So as our technology advances, and as we get closer and closer to, we build more specialized AI, and maybe one day we'll get to a general AI, but having an intelligence that is non-human that we can interact with, and that can kind of serve as that translator to wider experience that we don't have a direct sensory connection to. What if that is the link that is necessary to bridge the gap? What if we have to reach that point where our technology can serve, as that go-between, that emissary to the phenomenon itself? And it strikes me too that the phenomenon, if it is sufficiently advanced, I mean, it has to have its own, very, very impressive technologies that, would either be, sort of cybernetic perhaps, or non-biological entirely. I mean, who knows? There are lots of different ways you can look at that problem, but nevertheless, an intelligent species is sort of always using its knowledge to craft these, sort of tools that expand its capability in the world, that expand what it can do and how it can interact with reality itself. And so what are the tools that these intelligences have and use? How connected are they with those? What are the technologies that we are developing and can use? How connected are we with those? And will there ever be kind of this, sort of Venn diagram merger of the two where these kinds of experiences and technologies can kind of connect with each other and help make sense of the other's experience? I think that would be, really fascinating, and hopefully lead to sort of a new enlightenment for us, as opposed to, kind of I think my biggest fear would be a type of, kind of enslavement to it, that whatever is great about humanity kind of becomes really subjugated to these technological advances. I would hope that we don't lose those things and we become monolithic in the process. That worries me a lot, that we don't lose our diversity of culture and experience. And when I read accounts of different, species and whatnot, it all sounds pretty, kind of one-dimensional. You don't get a sense that there's a lot of diversity in that particular species. But I could be wrong about that, and I hope that I am.
Yeah, I mean that in itself is a fascinating sort of piece to pay attention to, right? You could look at that two different ways. You could say that lack of diversity is because they've kind of, have kind of a Borg mentality, from Star Trek, where they have kind of one collective mind, like kind of like an ant species. Or you could say that we just lack the sophistication to notice the nuanced differences because they are a different species. When we look at 100 koalas, they might seem very similar to us.
Right.
Perhaps to them, they notice really distinct differences. Mm-hmm. So part of it's that challenge of, cross species kind of analysis and how much nuance, are we aware of with them? So for you and I, when we're talking, or any two people are talking, we've evolved to be able to pick up the smallest difference in our facial features, our body language, our tone of voice. Such a rich tapestry that we can draw from, right, to communicate. And one wonders if we have to start from scratch to some degree, or do we, with these others? They might have, you often hear again in the literature, and you'll hear me say that a lot on this show, because I think what we have to keep going back to is the data. What does the data tell us? What are the different narratives coming through? One of them is that they're kind of featureless. They don't have the same sort of array of facial features that we do. Mm-hmm. You don't often hear about them breaking out in a huge smile, right. Things like that. And yet they can communicate rich emotion sometimes through telepathic means, right? So you don't need a rich diversity of facial features if you can share direct experience of your inner self, right? Which is what we hear so often. In fact, for many experiencers, that's completely overwhelming. So again, just another piece that we bring to the picture, is it that they are, kind of a monoculture and they're all very similar and they don't think for themselves?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it that we don't have the capacity yet to notice those differences at that degree because we have no evolutionary history doing that?
Right.
And when we first make contact, maybe that's just the beginning of that process. I think back to a movie like Arrival, to pick up on what you were saying there about, what if a species is very different, thinks very differently? Their experience of reality itself is different.
Right.
Time, right? We know, going back to Einstein, that time is this persistent illusion, the way that we experience it. So we know that, right? We sort of cognitively can nod our heads at the notion that what we think of as time is more an illusion than anything else.
Right.
So we shouldn't expect other species, I would argue, to experience reality in the same way, because we already know that reality probably is different than the way we experience it. So, yeah, how that's going to work is fascinating, and I think one of the things I'm looking forward to doing on this show is diving into different elements of the literature, like different narratives that exist, because partly my brain right now just goes, do I want to talk about this angle or this angle or this angle?
Yep.
And probably what's better to do is to sort of like take different pieces of the totality of the literature and talk about that, But one thing you brought up that really made me think was you were talking about, technology and AI and where we are as a species, forgetting for a second the UFO phenomenon, right? So we as a species are approaching this technological singularity, right? Where I think sometimes it's hard for us to have perspective on how quickly things are changing. When you look at the last 100 years and how that's just the smallest slice of time compared to the history of our species, let alone our planet, our galaxy, the age of the universe. The rapidity with which we're increasing this curve towards this technological singularity is astonishing, and one can't help but wonder if that, along with things like us still having a mentality where we have nuclear weapons pointed at each other, and that we contemplate bioweapons in the midst of a pandemic and things like that, that part of the reason they're here is not about them, but about us, that we are at a particular point where it's not that we think of ourselves with this self-importance, but rather we look at it and say, maybe we just need help. Maybe we just actually have some humility and say, look, we're dancing with the devil, so to speak here. We are on the precipice of self-destruction. And even if there is some element of a prime directive kind of mentality that, like you use the analogy of this species in the ocean that's beginning to develop some rudimentary technology. If you were looking on, maybe the one time you would say, look, let's make an exception. Let's break our usual rule and let's make contact is if you see that intelligence on the precipice of self-destruction, which it's not a stretch to imagine that that's how they look at us. And then I even think about the fascinating aspects that come out of the literature that at first sound bizarre and hard to believe, and yet you hear it time and time again, which is that when we detonate nuclear weapons, it seems to have some sort of interdimensional impact that we don't fully understand. These others are telling us, some of them. We don't understand the fabric of reality enough to know the consequences for the larger sort of interdimensional biosphere, right? When we do things like that. So again, I think we are cavemen, at the precipice of a whole new level of awareness here. But it is fascinating to think about, how where we are as a species, and moving towards this technological singularity, being on the precipice of self-destruction at the same time as we seem to be seeing this ramping up. And even since, look at the data, even since the dawn of the atomic age, basically, there seems to have been a major increase. Trinity, Roswell, everything seems to have spun up since then. So what is that about? You hear different narratives, right, to make sense of the data, but it's hard to argue with the fact that something is going on.
Yeah, no, for sure. And, that makes me think too, as we talk about about these others and that term itself, other, we thinking about the show and kind of what we hope to kind of get out of it, the process of othering in general is a process by which we are engaging in an exercise in self-knowledge as well as other knowledge. So as we go through these discussions and look at the phenomenon through the various lenses and frameworks that are available to us, we are not just hopefully kind of filling in sort of the color that is there for the variety of expressions that the others take, but we are also, I think, better manifesting our own sense of self, our own sense of place within the world and history and the universe. So these exercises of exploration really help define who we are. And that has always been the case. And maybe it is our technology that sort of, pinnacle of achievement for us as a species to kind of create, not through our biology, but through our intellect, an other that is sort of in our image, to use that phrase, that is uniquely in our image. That brings us to a point where we are going to be faced with ourselves in a way that we've never been faced before. We'll be faced with sort of new, I think, truths about who we are. And maybe they are there, having gone through presumably that same exercise in their own past. They are there to help us kind of navigate those waters, at least some of them. And maybe the others of them, as you said, are completely indifferent. And even in their indifference, if that is the case, we have to wrestle with that truth, and it still makes us, I think, more complete and more mature in our sort of understanding of both who we are and what the universe is like and where we are within it. But yeah, as we kind of wrap up the show, I mean, what are some things that you're hoping that what are the things you're looking forward to in the show, and where are we headed?
Well, I think we've kind of, touched on the fact that this is an insanely multifaceted topic. You could do, 100 years of shows and still barely be, getting to the bottom of what's really going on. There's, like I said, because there's so few baselines, it makes it difficult to arrive at certainty. But I think both you and I are okay with that and are enjoying the journey. And touching on what you just said there, I completely agree that this is as much about redefining what it means to be a human being as it is about defining these others and understanding them. And I don't think you can do one without the other.
Mm-hmm.
I think that even when you see different societies, different cultures within one species, our species, interact, they inevitably are changed, right? When you look at cities that exist on coastal areas so that they are more quick to interact with internationals, right? It changes those cities. We there's more of a cosmopolitan kind of character to those cities, right? And so then that's just human population, right? So how quickly and greatly will we be transformed by an interaction with the other that, like you say, provides a mirror unto ourselves that we've never had before.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. In terms of where we're going to go with the show, I think, as we've sort of discussed today, I think it'll be really interesting to take on different frames, right? To take a different pair of glasses each time and say, let's look at it from this perspective. There are some people who say that part of the phenomenon is these higher consciousness beings who are here to help us ascend to the fifth dimension, right? What does that mean? What do we mean by that? What does that look like? What are the moving parts in that? There are other people who say this is people will say even the government, that the people within the government that are in the know will say there's definitely a spiritual element to this, spiritual component to this phenomenon. What do we mean by that? Today I was dialoguing with someone who was wondering if the Cullen's elite is correct and that these are demons. And what I was trying to help him see was that, well, what do you mean by demons? Do you
Mm,
mean that a very particular framing from a fundamentalist Christian perspective? And if you believe that, you have to swallow the entire
hmm
rest of the creation myth and all of the mythology along with it?
hmm
Or are they also just examples of people in history trying to make sense of this same phenomena
Right.
and applying categories and the thinking of that time, just like we're trying to do now?
Mm,
Again, I think part of the challenge here is it comes both ways, that we can tend to miss the mark by saying, okay, look, fairies do this kind of thing. They kidnap people.
mm,
Great aliens kidnap people. So therefore, they must be the same entity.
right.
We don't know that, and that's a fairly superficial
Mm,
analysis. And they might be doing it for very different reasons.
mm,
The whole hybridization
mm,
aspect and the biological, part that the taking of sperm and eggs
hmm
and it happening over multiple generations. All of this is fascinating. That perhaps there is an interaction happening, but it's happening on a subversive level, right?
hmm
Or maybe those high consciousness beings that are trying to help us ascend are here along with another species that's actually trying to manipulate our genome and create hybridized beings. Maybe some of them are us from the future, and they're trying to improve their stock because of some catastrophe they've run into
mm,
in a different timeline or something.
right.
These are all worth exploring. So what I'm looking forward to, and then I'm going to turn it on to you to have you answer the same question. But for me, I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to, in detail, look at each of those,
Mm,
the strengths, the weaknesses, what aspects of the data fit that, which don't. Um, because neither one of us is attached to a particular perspective, I'm excited about putting on different pairs of glasses each time and examining each one honestly, fairly, and as objectively as we can. But how about you? What are you looking forward to in this show in the future?
yeah, I think I look at it almost from the standpoint of languages or sort of cuisine from different cultures, learning to appreciate all of these different sort of modes of interaction, being able to be conversant in them and appreciate them for what they are. I think that makes us more well-rounded, and it also is. It's not just when you're doing that. When we're looking at it from these different frameworks, we're not just picking each of them up and putting them back down. When we go through that entire exercise, we are also in the process of creating new frameworks that are sort of incorporating components of all of those different modes and tools, such that we have a new language to use to explain what we are observing, new hypotheses to test, and that process is recursive, right? It just kind of keeps going and going, and for me, that sort of journey, that intellectual exercise, is a huge reason why I wanted to do this show, because I knew that with you and with our audience, we'll have the partnership that I would want to be able to have that conversation and kind of develop that ability and strengthen that ability in tackling this subject. So, I'm very excited for the project. I'm looking forward to seeing kind of where it takes us, and looking forward to seeing what the reaction is of those who are listening. And I guess on that note, I will say, as we kind of wrap up the first episode here, there are a couple of places where people can get in touch with us if they want to interact with us, and we certainly hope that they do. You can find us at Liminal Phrames on Twitter. Liminal Phrames will also be available on your podcast platform of choice, so should be available on Spotify, Apple, Google, all the different feeds there. And then EXO, people can find you on YouTube as well, right? On your ExoAcademian YouTube channel. And will our content be there? Is that where we'll host some of this as well?
Yeah, so we will have Liminal Frames will be, like you said, it'll be its own dedicated podcast, which will be every 2 weeks is what we're aiming for. We'll do kind of a 90-minute episode every 2 weeks, tackling a different frame each time. And And that will be on, like you said, on Google Podcasts, Apple, Spotify, all the usual players. And then in terms of YouTube, we will also upload these episodes to my YouTube channel, which is /ExoAcademian. So
Nice.
at the ExoAcademian YouTube channel, you'll find the Point of Convergence episodes, which air once a week. And also, as a separate playlist, you will be able to find each of the Liminal Frame episodes as well.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, and then I guess just wrapping up too, you can find me on Twitter. I'm at @awaifsoul. You can also find me on my other show, Calling All Beings, on YouTube. Hope you check that out for more sort of community-focused take on the phenomenon. And then Exo, folks can find you on Twitter as well, right? So your handle is at ExoAcademian.
Yep. At ExoAcademian, just like it sounds. Find me there. I'm also on Facebook as well. And the other thing I would add too, as we wrap up here, is we really do want this to be a cooperative, interactive process. So we would love for people to, write in with questions they have. If you think there's points that we're not tackling fairly, then point those out. I think, again, neither one of us is attached to a particular perspective. We value seeing it from different viewpoints and a multi-perspectival view. If you think that we are, looking at it with too much of one lens and not another, bring that to our attention. If you think there's an aspect of the data that we either are unfamiliar with or are ignoring, let us know. We really want this to be an ongoing journey together. I think we see ourselves to some degree as tour guides, where, in the midst of this discombobulating assortment of phenomena, which it's hard to even say, how much is alien, how much is interdimensional, how much is the collective unconscious manifesting in, egregores and all sorts of crazy stuff, and to what degree is human nature evolving to the point where we ourselves are manifesting aspects of reality that we're not fully even in touch with yet. All of these are fascinating questions, and we hope to tackle each of them fairly and honestly and objectively. So we would love to hear from people in terms of ideas they'd like us to tackle, and also feedback when you've heard us talk about a certain hypothesis or viewpoint or aspect of the data. Let us know what you think, and that'll help feed into future shows.
Absolutely. Yeah, well said. The questions are essential, and the answers as well, and the theories. And with that being said, I think we'll wrap it up. So from us at Liminal Phrames, Nathan and ExoAcademian, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Phrames.